Welcome, friend, to another journey together. Tonight you will experience deep understanding drawn from powerful ancient knowledge designed to guide the restless mind towards unmatched calm and truly healing peace. Feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. I will share a special collection of deep Buddhist stories and Zen riddles and insights that peel back the layers to reveal the gentle art of freeing your mind and freeing your emotions. Each story holds a powerful teaching that can completely change how you see stress, worry, non-stop thinking, and the never-ending search for happiness outside yourself. These aren't simply stories to drift off to. They are carefully guarded instructions handed down by masters who understood a deep truth that many have lost. That real calmness isn't found by rearranging the world around you, but by fixing your inner world. As the great Zen master Dogen said, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. Through the course of our shared listening, you'll discover exactly how these ancient messages can light up your path. As we journey through these amazing tales, you'll feel a gentle yet powerful shift take hold. The tight grip of anxiety will gently let go. The constant noise of your thoughts will begin to fade away. You'll find yourself easily settling into a state of deep insight and deep calmness. So allow yourself to sink deeply now. Let your body relax into whatever is holding you. Take one slow breath with me, and as you release it, know that you are about to receive wisdom that has always been here patiently waiting for you. Let us explore a story about the big difference between fighting against things and accepting them. In the mountains where mist clings to old peaks, there stood a monastery where Zen master Baizhang taught his students the mysteries of waking up. For many days, an elderly figure had appeared among the monks during evening talks, arriving silently and leaving when the others did. His presence seemed natural, normal, until one evening, when all the monks had walked out into the cool mountain air, he stayed. Baizhang approached the lone figure, noticing something magical in his stillness. "Who are you standing here before me?" the master asked with gentle curiosity. The old man's eyes held deep sadness from long ago as he replied, "I am not a man, though I look like one. In a time long past, during the age of the Kasyapa Buddha, I served as head monk of this very mountain. An eager student once came to me with a question that would seal my fate. Does an enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect? In my pride, I answered clearly, no, they do not fall under such laws. For this single wrong word, I was punished to live as a wild fox for 500 lifetimes, watching seasons turn from forest floors, never able to return to human form." The old man's voice shook with the weight of hundreds of years. "Master, I beg you to speak a turning word that might release me from this trap." He then asked the same dangerous question. Does an enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect? Baizhang looked deeply into the old man's eyes, seeing both the monk he had been and the fox he had become. With calm certainty, he replied, "An enlightened person is one with the law of cause and effect." Upon hearing these words, the old man's whole being seemed to change. Tears of freedom flowed down his cheeks as he bowed deeply. "I am free," he whispered. "My body lies in a cave on the far side of this mountain. I ask that you honor it with a proper funeral." The following dawn, Baizhang led his confused monks up the winding mountain path. Behind a group of rocks, his staff revealed the still body of a great fox. As incense smoke curled up to the sky, the master performed the funeral ceremony usually kept for monks, honoring the spirit that had finally found its way home. The Buddha once said, "What we think, we become. What we feel, we attract. What we imagine, we create." This ancient wisdom lights up the heart of Baizhang's teaching. The difference between being controlled by and being one with the flow of life changed 5 centuries of suffering into a moment of freedom. Why do we so often fight the natural laws that rule our lives? Zen Buddhism shows that our suffering comes largely from our attempt to stand apart from life's basic patterns rather than flowing with them. The fox monk's first mistake wasn't just in his head. It showed a deeper human habit to believe we can somehow rise above or escape the basic rules that shape all experience. When we say we are exempt from cause and effect, we create what Buddhism calls the illusion of separation. We imagine ourselves as independent agents cut off from the web of connection that links all things. This dream of being separate becomes a prison cutting us off from the natural wisdom available when we recognize our deep unity with life itself. Think about how this pattern shows up in daily life. When we fight aging, we suffer more than aging itself causes. When we fight against failure, we create extra pain beyond the disappointment. When we struggle against difficult emotions, we make them stronger through our resistance. Each time we say, "This shouldn't be happening to me," we shoot ourselves with the second arrow of unnecessary suffering. The enlightened person doesn't escape cause and effect, but dances with it. They understand that freedom comes not from standing outside natural law, but from flowing so completely with it that there's no feeling of separation between self and situation. As Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi taught, "You are perfect as you are, and you could use a little improvement." Both statements are true at the same time when we stop fighting reality. Vietnamese master Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of this when he said, "Thanks to things changing, everything is possible." When we truly accept that all things happen and pass according to causes and conditions, we discover freedom within those very conditions. The fox's freedom came not from escaping natural law, but from embracing his complete part in it. This understanding changes our relationship to personal responsibility. Instead of a burden, being accountable becomes a source of power. When we're one with cause and effect, every choice becomes an opportunity to plant seeds of wisdom. Every moment, a chance to align with good patterns. Tonight, as you notice areas where you're fighting against what is, can you experiment with the phrase "one with" instead of "controlled by"? Where in your life might you discover freedom not through fighting, but through complete acceptance of your part in the great unfolding? As the Buddha taught, hatred does not stop by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. The eternal rule isn't a trap, but the very fabric from which freedom is made. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about seeing beauty within loss. In the mountain temple where Master Yunmen lived, autumn arrived with its familiar poetry of change. The old maples that had shaded the meditation halls through summer's heat now showed their amazing change. Golden and red leaves dancing in the crisp air. A young monk, his heart heavy with the sadness that often comes with seasonal change, sought out his teacher. The beauty of autumn stirred something sad inside him, a recognition of life's short nature that he found hard to bear. The falling leaves seemed to whisper of his own death, of all the losses he would surely face. Finding Master Yunmen sweeping the temple yard, the monk approached with his heavy questions. "Master," he began, his voice carrying the weight of deep thought. "When the tree withers and the leaves fall, what is really happening? I look at this beauty and feel only sadness. Why does nature's beauty remind me so strongly of ending and decay?" The master paused in his sweeping, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked up at the branches above them where leaves caught the afternoon sunlight like stained glass windows. In the distance, more leaves spun downward in their ancient dance, each one unique in its final journey. Rather than offering a bookish talk on change or the Buddhist teaching of anicca, Yunmen simply replied with poetic plainness, "The golden wind is revealing itself." In that moment, the monk felt something shift in how he saw things. Where he had seen only ending, his teacher pointed to beginning. Where he had noticed only death, Yunmen revealed life showing itself in yet another form. The autumn wind wasn't destroying the leaves. It was the season's own nature, showing up perfectly, completely without apology. Buddha's wisdom reminds us the past is gone, the future is not yet here, and life can only be found in the present moment. What comes from this story is our habit to put our ideas of loss onto life's natural expressions of change. Why do we struggle to see the golden wind when we're focused on the falling leaves? Zen Buddhism points to our habit of seeing short-lived things through the lens of personal fear rather than universal wisdom. We project our worry about our own changes onto every changing thing, missing the vital energy that drives change itself. Our minds, trained to seek permanence in a changing world, automatically label change as a threat. When leaves fall, we see death coming. When relationships change, we fear being left alone. When our bodies age, we feel only decline. This mental training blinds us to what Yunmen called the golden wind, the moving force of life showing itself through every change. But what if autumn isn't about ending, but about reaching a peak? What if the falling leaves represent not death, but the tree's ultimate gift? Returning food to the soil that will feed future growth. The golden wind reveals that what looks like loss is actually life's generous sharing of energy from one form to another. Think about the changes in your own experience. A job change that felt like failure might show itself as freedom to explore new possibilities. The end of a relationship that brought grief might create space for deeper self-understanding. Even physical aging, which our culture teaches us to fight, might be seen as life's golden wind, revealing new forms of wisdom and acceptance. Zen master Dogen taught, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. When we forget our small, fearful self that holds on to unchanging forms, we recognize ourselves as expressions of the same golden wind that moves through all things. We're not separate watchers watching life decay. We're life itself, dancing through countless changes. This recognition changes grief into thanks. The leaves don't fall unwillingly. They let go with perfect timing, each one a small celebration of completion. When we align with this natural rhythm, our own changes become less scary and more graceful. Vietnamese teacher Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, thanks to things changing, everything is possible. The golden wind that releases autumn's leaves also brings spring's flowers. The same force that ages our bodies also deepens our capacity for wisdom and kindness. Tonight, as you watch changes happening in your life or the world around you, can you look for the golden wind within things that look like endings? Perhaps you'll notice new possibilities coming from old forms or recognize your own part in life's endless creativity. The Buddha taught, all made things are temporary. Work out your freedom with hard work. The golden wind isn't something to be grabbed or fought, but recognized as the very way through which waking up happens. Our next story reveals the deep teaching that exists beyond the limits of words and ideas. In the monastery where Zen master Mazu lived and taught, strange wisdom flowed like mountain streams, sudden, direct, and impossible to catch in containers of normal understanding. One morning, as mist still clung to the temple roof, an eager young monk approached the master with the burning question that had taken over his meditation practice. He had studied texts, memorized holy books, and analyzed notes, yet felt no closer to truth. Bowing respectfully before Mazu, he asked with true longing, "Master, what is the heart of the Buddha's teaching? I have searched through volumes of scripture, but the words seem to hide rather than light up the truth. Please show me the heart of the teaching." Mazu looked at the monk with eyes that seemed to see both the asker and the question as one smooth expression. Without waiting, without getting ready, without offering even a moment of normal explanation, the master opened his mouth and let out a huge shout that seemed to come from the very depths of life itself. Ha! The sound exploded through the monastery like thunder, echoing off wooden beams and stone walls. Birds burst from the nearby trees in startled flight. Other monks in distant halls paused in their activities, hearts suddenly racing from the power of that unexpected roar. The young monk stood frozen, his carefully prepared questions scattered like leaves in a hurricane. In that moment of stunning silence that followed the shout, something deep had been passed on. Not through explanation or study, but through direct meeting with the raw energy of waking up itself. The monk remained speechless, his thinking mind temporarily broken by the suddenness of the experience. Later that day, another student curious about what had happened approached the young monk. "I heard the master gave you a teaching this morning. What did he say to you?" Still somewhat dazed, the monk replied simply, "The master shouted at me." The second student, interested by such an unusual teaching method, sought out Mazu directly. "Master, I heard you shouted at the monk who asked about the heart of the teaching. Is this true?" "Yes," Mazu replied with his usual directness. "But what was the meaning of your shout? What were you trying to say?" Instead of providing the detailed explanation the student expected, Mazu responded with another earth-shaking shout. Music. This time, it is said the student achieved immediate enlightenment. His mind suddenly released from the prison of thinking with words into the vast openness of direct understanding. As the Buddha observed, all things come from mind. When the mind is understood, all things are understood. The deeper teaching here shows us that true wisdom cannot be packaged in ideas, but must be experienced directly beyond the use of thought. Why do we naturally seek explanations for mystery rather than allowing ourselves to be touched by it? Zen Buddhism reveals that our thinking mind, while useful for handling practical reality, becomes a roadblock when we try to use it to grasp the heart of life itself. Like trying to capture the wind in a jar, our attempts to hold ultimate reality in thoughts and words surely fail. Mazu's shout cuts through what Zen calls the thicket of views. Our complicated mental buildings about reality that actually separate us from direct experience. The mind that asks, "What does this mean?" is the same mind that stands between us and immediate understanding. The shout doesn't answer the question, it dissolves the questioner. Think about how often we mistake the description for the experience itself. We read about love instead of loving, study maps instead of taking journeys, analyze meditation ways instead of simply sitting in awareness. Our education trains us to believe that understanding comes through gathering information. But Zen points to a different kind of knowing that comes when we drop below the level of thinking. This isn't against thinking, but rather an invitation to recognize the limits of book understanding when it comes to deep truth. As a Korean Zen master taught, "Only don't know." This don't know mind isn't stupidity, but rather an openness that can receive direct passing of wisdom. Mazu's shout represents what Zen calls direct pointing, a teaching method that skips the complicated detours of explanation and delivers truth immediately, heart to heart, mind to mind. The sound itself becomes the teaching, carrying more information than volumes of explanation could say. Notice in your own experience the difference between knowing about something and knowing it directly. You can study descriptions of chocolate for years, but the first taste delivers understanding that no amount of study could provide. Similarly, the heart of Buddha's teaching isn't contained in scriptures, but in the direct recognition of your own true nature. 20th century teacher Jiddu Krishnamurti expressed this when he said truth is a land without paths. The land without paths can't be reached through maps and directions, but only through the willingness to step beyond the known into direct meeting with what is. Tonight, as thoughts about the meaning of your experiences rise, can you experiment with Mazu's approach? Instead of analyzing what your life means, can you simply shout, "Ha!" and feel the aliveness that exists before interpretation? The Buddha taught, "Be a lamp unto yourself." The lamp lights up not through explanation, but through its own bright nature. Sometimes the most deep teaching is a wordless shout that breaks our assumptions and reveals the brilliant obviousness we've been overlooking. Let us now turn to a tale about the difference between collecting wisdom and living it. In the time when Master Foyan taught in the ancient mountains of China, students would travel great distances carrying bundles of books and minds stuffed with spiritual ideas. They arrived like merchants with carts full of precious goods, eager to add to their collections of holy knowledge. One such student approached the master with visible frustration written across his young face. His travelling pack bulged with scrolls and texts, his notebook filled with carefully copied passages and notes upon notes. His robes were worn from travel, and his eyes carried the tiredness of one who had been searching for something that remained always just beyond reach. Despite years of hard study, he felt like a man dying of thirst while carrying detailed descriptions of water. Bowing deeply, he presented his problem to Foyan. "Venerable Master," he began, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I have devoted many years to studying the holy books. I have committed countless teachings to memory and can recite the words of ancient wise men by heart. I know the Lotus Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra. I can explain the Noble Eightfold Path and discuss the subtle differences between various schools of Buddhist thought. Yet despite all this learning, I feel no closer to enlightenment. My mind churns constantly with ideas and rules, but wisdom remains as hard to catch as morning mist." Foyan listened with the patient attention of one who had heard this particular suffering many times before. He watched how the student's very posture showed the weight of gathered knowledge, shoulders slightly bent as if carrying an invisible library, eyes that moved constantly as if checking every moment against remembered texts. When the student finished speaking, the master smiled with gentle understanding. "You are like a man who owns the most detailed map of a great treasure," he replied. "You can describe every landmark on that map with perfect accuracy, every river crossing, every mountain pass, every dangerous ravine, every cave where the treasure might be hidden. You know the land better than those who drew the map. You could guide others through the geography with your eyes closed. Yet notice this, you have no dust on your sandals." The student looked down at his clean feet, beginning to grasp the master's meaning. His sandals were indeed clean, unmarked by the rough stones and muddy paths that would soil the feet of an actual traveller. Foyan continued, "Your knowledge is huge and exact, but it remains completely just an idea. You have never taken a single step on the actual path toward the treasure you claim to seek. You are like a person who studies swimming ways in great detail, but has never gotten wet, or someone who memorizes recipes, but has never lit a cooking fire." The meaning of this teaching began to dawn on the student, but his usual patterns of thinking immediately came back. "So then, Master, should I throw away the books entirely? Should I discard all this learning that has consumed my years?" "No," Foyan replied with a slight shake of his head. "You should not throw away the books. Instead, you should allow the books to throw away you. When you walk, simply walk without carrying the burden of how the Buddha described proper walking meditation. When you eat, simply eat, without mentally comparing your meal to descriptions of the Buddha's food, or analyzing whether your mindfulness matches the instructions you've memorized. When you read the sacred texts, let the words wash over you like a stream flowing over smooth stones. Do not try to grasp them, own them, or add them to your mental collection." The student frowned, struggling to understand this puzzle. "But if I don't try to understand the teachings, how can I learn from them? Surely there's value in deep study and thinking." Foyan's eyes twinkled with amused kindness. "The truth is not contained in the words themselves, but in the opening of your own awakened mind as you meet them. A holy book is like moonlight reflecting on water. You cannot scoop up the moon with a bucket, but you can allow its light to light up your path. The moon's reflection appears easily when the water is still, but disturb the surface with grabbing and the image breaks into meaningless ripples." He pointed toward the monastery garden where a monk was simply sweeping leaves. "Watch him. He learned to sweep not by studying texts about sweeping, but by moving the broom day after day until the motion became natural. Now the sweeping happens through him rather than by him. This is how wisdom works. Not as information stored in the mind, but as understanding that flows through our entire being. The student watched the sweeping monk and noticed something amazing. There was no self-consciousness in the movement, no reference to technique, just the pure expression of purposeful action. The monk wasn't thinking about sweeping. He had become sweeping itself. From that day forward, the student learned to approach the teaching differently. Instead of studying texts like a scholar gathering facts for a test, he read them as one who listens to wind moving through pine branches. Alert, open, but without the grasping hunger that had previously driven his studies. When passages spoke of kindness, he looked for chances to be kind rather than memorizing definitions. When texts described mindfulness, he practiced paying attention to his breath rather than analyzing the instructions. Gradually, he discovered that when he stopped trying to capture wisdom, it began to enter him naturally. The teaching started working on him at levels deeper than book understanding. His movements became more graceful, his speech more thoughtful, his presence more peaceful, not because he was following rules, but because the spirit of the teachings had taken root in his actual experience. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared." This tale shows the difference between hoarding spiritual information and allowing wisdom to flow through us into living expression. Why do we so often mistake the gathering of spiritual knowledge for spiritual growth itself? Zen Buddhism points to our deep belief that more information equals greater understanding. This shopping mind, which serves us well in material matters, becomes a trap when applied to inner change. We collect teachings like souvenirs, building impressive libraries of ideas while remaining fundamentally unchanged by what we've gathered. Our culture supports this pattern non-stop. We measure smarts by information memory, success by gathered skills, and progress by visible achievement. When we bring this same framework to spiritual growth, we unconsciously treat wisdom like any other thing to be bought, stored, and shown off. We become spiritual shoppers rather than spiritual practitioners. The student's problem reflects a common spiritual trap. What Zen calls Zen sickness. The condition of being so full of spiritual ideas that there's no room for actual experience. We become like people describing the taste of water while dying of thirst, or experts on swimming who've never gotten wet. Our minds become cluttered storage units filled with unused tools for change. This pattern shows up everywhere in modern life, not just in formal spiritual study. Think about the person who owns dozens of self-help books but continues struggling with the same life challenges. They can quote experts on getting things done while their own lives remain messy. They know the latest research on happiness while feeling constantly unsatisfied. They've memorized relationship advice while their own connections suffer from neglect, or observe the fitness fan who reads every study about best food and exercise, but whose body remains unchanged because they rarely leave the world of theory for actual practice. They can argue about training ideas endlessly, but lack the dust on their shoes that comes from consistent daily walks. The psychology behind this pattern runs deep. There's a real reward feeling that comes from learning new information, creating the feeling of progress without requiring the discomfort of actual change. Reading about courage feels easier than acting bravely. Studying kindness seems safer than opening our hearts to difficult people. Thinking about mindfulness requires less openness than sitting quietly with our actual worries. Also, our ego finds clever ways to use spiritual knowledge as armor against real change. We can hide behind fancy ideas, using our understanding of non-attachment to avoid commitment, or our knowledge of change to skip responsibility. The very teachings meant to free us become subtle ways to avoid real work. True spiritual study requires what Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls beginner's mind. Approaching each text, each teaching, each moment of practice with fresh openness, rather than the heavy expectation of our gathered knowledge. When we read with beginner's mind, the words can work on us at levels deeper than book understanding. But what does it actually look like to let the books throw away you? As Foyan suggested, it means reading about patience and then immediately looking for chances to practice it with difficult people, rather than adding patience techniques to our mental filing system. It means meeting teachings on sharing and suddenly offering help to someone in need, rather than analyzing different philosophical approaches to giving. When we study this way, change happens naturally. A passage about letting go doesn't become another idea to memorize, but an invitation to release whatever we're gripping too tightly in that moment. Words about loving kindness don't remain dreamy ideals, but inspire us to send a kind text to someone we've been avoiding. Korean Zen master Seung San taught only go straight. Don't know mind. This is very important. The don't know mind isn't stupidity, but rather an openness that allows real learning to happen. When we approach teachings without the burden of our ideas, they can surprise us, challenge us, and change us in ways our thinking mind never expected. The key insight in Foyan's teaching is that spiritual texts work on us most effectively when we stop trying to work on them. Like seeds planted in good soil, teachings grow in the open ground of a mind that's present and undefended, rather than grasping and analyzing. Tonight, as you meet any form of wisdom, whether in books, conversations, or direct experience, can you experiment with letting it wash over you like a stream? Can you receive teachings without immediately trying to file them away in mental boxes or convert them into practical uses? The Buddha taught, work out your freedom with hard work. But perhaps the most diligent work is learning to get out of our own way, allowing change to happen through openness rather than effort. True spiritual study leaves dust on our sandals and space in our minds. Now let us explore a Zen story about the big shift from seeking answers to embracing the fullness of life itself. In a monastery where ancient riddles had been thought about for centuries, a young monk found himself wrestling with perhaps the most famous riddle in all of Zen tradition. Day after day, month after month, he sat in meditation, attempting to solve the mystery of what is the sound of one hand clapping. His master watched the growing frustration that clouded the young monk's once peaceful face. The question had become an obsession, a mental knot that tightened with each passing day of useless thinking. Where once there had been natural ease in the monk's practice, now there was only the grinding tension of a mind trying to solve what cannot be solved through thinking. One morning, after the monk had spent another sleepless night turning the riddle over in his mind like a key that refused to fit any lock, his teacher approached him with an unexpected instruction. "My dear student," the master said with gentle authority, "you will leave the monastery today. Go into the town below and stay there for 1 full week. During this time, I want you to forget completely about the riddle. Do not think about one hand or its sound. Simply watch what presents itself to your senses. Walk, listen, watch, but make no effort to understand or achieve anything." Though confused by this strange guidance, the monk packed his simple belongings and walked down the mountain path toward the busy valley town. For the first time in months, he was told not to meditate on the famous riddle that had consumed his thoughts. As he entered the crowded marketplace, his ears were immediately filled with the sounds of people living. Sellers called out their goods in singing chants: fresh vegetables, sweet rice, fine cloth. Children's laughter bubbled up from side streets, where they played with simple toys. The steady hammering of a blacksmith created a steady beat underlying the town's music, while nearby, a beggar sang ancient folk songs in exchange for coins. Day by day, the monk wandered through this lively human landscape without a plan. He watched heated arguments between merchants and tender moments of kindness between strangers. He watched the hurried pace of those rushing to appointments and the slow walk of elders who had learned to enjoy time itself. He felt the warmth of afternoon sun on his shoulders and the tiredness that gathered in his legs from hours of walking on stone streets. Slowly, something began to shift in how he saw things. Without the pressure of seeking the answer to his riddle, his awareness became more open, more ready for the feeling of immediate experience. He found himself simply present with whatever happened, no longer filtering reality through the lens of spiritual seeking. When the week ended and he returned to the monastery, his master immediately noticed the change in his look. The tight concentration that had previously marked his face had been replaced by a quality of relaxed alertness. "Tell me," the master asked, "did you discover the sound of one hand during your time in the world?" The monk was silent for a long moment, not searching for the right answer, but allowing his direct experience to find expression. Finally, he spoke with quiet certainty. "The sound of one hand is the joy in the rice seller's voice when he makes a sale. It is the perfect silence that exists between the blacksmith's hammer strikes. It is the warmth of sunlight touching my face and the honest tiredness that comes from walking many miles. The sound of one hand is not separate from the world. It is the world itself showing its own nature." His master smiled with deep satisfaction. The young monk had finally stopped listening for something and had begun hearing everything. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us when you realize how perfect everything is, you will tilt your head back and laugh at the sky. Here we discover that the deepest spiritual insights come not from intense seeking, but from the willingness to be fully present with ordinary experience. Why do we imagine that deep realization requires special circumstances? Zen Buddhism reveals that our very searching often becomes the block to finding what we seek. Like someone wildly looking for glasses that are already resting on their nose, we exhaust ourselves chasing what is immediately available in each moment. The monk's breakthrough shows what Zen teachers call ordinary mind is the way. The sound of one hand isn't a magical thing requiring special states of mind to see. It's the constant expression of life itself, audible to anyone willing to listen without the filter of expectation or the burden of spiritual ambition. Think about how this pattern appears in our own seeking. We meditate to achieve peace, while peace exists in the simple act of breathing. We study wisdom teachings to understand our true nature, while our true nature is the one who studies. We practice mindfulness to become present, while presence is what allows us to practice. The very effort to get what we already possess creates the dream of separation from it. The marketplace becomes the perfect classroom exactly because it's not trying to be spiritual. The seller's cry, the child's laughter, the blacksmith's rhythm, each is completely itself without faking or performance. They show what Zen calls suchness, the quality of being perfectly, unself-consciously what one is. Zen Master Huangbo taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." When the monk stopped thinking about one hand and began seeing with fresh eyes, the sound revealed itself as the entire music of life happening easily around him. This doesn't take away the value of formal practice, but rather lights up its purpose. Meditation, study, and thinking serve not to create special states, but to remove the mental static that prevents us from recognizing what has always been present. Like polishing a mirror, practice clears away the gathering of mental dust that hides our natural ability for direct seeing. The sound of one hand in your own life might be the satisfaction in your morning coffee, the ease of your breathing during exercise, the comfort in your pet's sleeping presence, or the simple miracle of mind itself reading these words. These aren't consolation prizes for failing to achieve enlightenment. They are enlightenment showing itself through the specific circumstances of your life. Tonight, as you notice the countless sounds that surround you, perhaps the hum of electricity, the distant traffic, your own heartbeat, can you hear them as expressions of the same source that moves through all things? Can you recognize that the one who listens and what is heard are waves in the same ocean of awareness? As the Buddha taught, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. The sound of one hand teaches us that living well means hearing the amazing within the ordinary. Loving well means embracing what is rather than wishing for what might be. And letting go well means releasing our grip on spiritual seeking itself. Let us continue our journey with a story about keeping inner balance regardless of outside circumstances. This is the teaching of Master Hakuin, and the power of Is That So? Master Hakuin lived in a small village where he was deeply respected for his wisdom, kindness, and great character. For decades, he had kept a reputation as a pure and enlightened teacher, someone who had risen above ordinary human weaknesses and lived the highest spiritual ideals. Villagers often brought their problems to him, seeking guidance and inspiration from his teachings and his perfect way of life. In this same village lived a beautiful young woman whose family was well known and respected. When she became pregnant without being married, her condition caused a scandal that spread through the close community. Her parents were furious and demanded to know who was responsible for bringing such shame upon their family. At first, the young woman refused to reveal the father's name. She was protecting someone she loved, someone whose reputation and future would be destroyed if the truth came out. But as her parents' anger grew and the pressure became too much, she made a desperate decision. In a moment of panic and confusion, she pointed to the one person she thought could handle this storm better than her actual lover, the respected Master Hakuin. When her angry parents confronted the Zen master with their daughter's claim, they expected cries of innocence, explanations, or at least some expression of shock at being falsely accused. Instead, Hakuin listened calmly to their angry words and simply replied, "Is that so?" His response only seemed to confirm their worst fears. Surely an innocent man would defend himself more strongly. The scandal exploded throughout the village. People who had looked up to Hakuin as a saint now whispered that he was a liar who had been living a lie. His reputation was destroyed overnight, and former students left him in disgust and disappointment. When the child was born, the parents brought the baby directly to Hakuin. "This is your responsibility now," they said bitterly. "Since you are the father, you must take care of this child." They pushed the baby into his arms and walked away, leaving him to face the results of a crime he had never committed. Again, Hakuin simply said, "Is that so?" and accepted the baby without protest or explanation. For many months, the former master cared for the child with gentle attention. He fed the baby, changed diapers, walked the floors during sleepless nights, and provided all the love and care that any loving parent would give. Neighbors who had once brought him gifts of food and respect now ignored him or spoke of him with hate. He had lost his position, his reputation, and his job, but he continued to care for the child with peaceful devotion. Meanwhile, the young woman struggled with the weight of her lie. Watching the respected teacher suffer for her trick while caring lovingly for a child that wasn't his became too much. The guilt ate her up until she could no longer live with what she had done. Finally, she confessed the truth to her parents. The real father was a young man in the village whom she had been trying to protect. Her parents were horrified to learn what they had done to an innocent man. They rushed to Hakuin's simple home with many apologies. "Master, we have wronged you terribly," they said, bowing deeply. "Our daughter has confessed that you are not the father. We know now that you have suffered unfairly for our mistake. Please forgive us and allow us to take the child back to its real family." Hakuin listened to their apologies with the same calmness he had shown to their accusations. As he gently placed the baby in their arms, he offered the same response he had given throughout the entire trouble. Is that so? As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, hatred does not stop by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What comes from this story is the deep power of keeping inner balance, regardless of how others see us or what situations life presents. Why do we allow outside events and other people's opinions to decide our inner state? Zen Buddhism teaches that true freedom comes from developing an unshakable center that remains stable whether we're being praised or blamed, honored or dishonored, treated fairly or unfairly. Hakuin's response is that so represents a deep spiritual practice. He wasn't being uncaring or passive. He was showing the ultimate non-attachment to reputation, status, and even justice itself. His steady response showed that his sense of worth and purpose came from within, rather than from outside approval. Think about how differently most of us would react to false accusations, public shame, and complete loss of reputation. The natural human response is to defend ourselves, to fight against injustice, to demand that others see the truth. But Hakuin's approach reveals another possibility, meeting all circumstances with the same peaceful acceptance. This doesn't mean we should never defend ourselves, or that we should weakly accept all injustices. Hakuin's teaching is more subtle. He shows us that our inner peace doesn't have to depend on outside circumstances being fair or good. We can keep our center regardless of how the world treats us. The Buddha taught, "You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger." Hakuin's calmness protected him from the extra suffering that would have come from anger, self-pity, or desperate attempts to fix his reputation. While the situation was surely hard, he didn't make the difficulty worse with emotional fighting. Look deeply at your own reactions to criticism, misunderstanding, or unfair treatment. How much of your suffering comes from the actual events, and how much comes from your mental and emotional responses to those events? Hakuin's example suggests that we have far more control over the second source of suffering than the first. Tonight, as you meet whatever judgments, misunderstandings, or unfair treatments life may bring, can you remember Master Hakuin's peaceful? Is that so? Can you find the space between what happens to you and how you respond? Discovering that your inner peace need not be held hostage by outside circumstances. Buddha's wisdom teaches us peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. True spiritual growth isn't measured by how well life treats us, but by how gracefully we can meet whatever life brings. Keeping our kindness, dignity, and inner calm, regardless of whether the world recognizes our worth or understands our true nature. Now let us experience a Zen story about the unexpected nature of enlightenment. This is the kitchen monk's realization. In the peaceful mountains surrounding Lake Hakone stood a great monastery known throughout Japan for its hard practice and deep wisdom. Among the monks lived a humble man named Ichi, whose life would teach us about the deep difference between seeking and finding. For 55 years, Ichi had worked faithfully in the monastery kitchen. While other monks sat in formal meditation or engaged in scholarly debates, Ichi chopped vegetables, tended fires, and prepared meals with quiet dedication. His hands had grown permanently stained. His back bent from years of service, yet he approached each task with careful attention. But Ichi carried a heavy burden. Since his earliest days, he had been assigned a riddle. One of those strange questions that Zen masters use to crack open the thinking mind. His was the famous puzzle. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Day after day, year after year, he wrestled with this question, trying to solve it through logic, guessing every approach his mind could think of. As decades passed, Ichi began to see himself as a failure. While other monks seemed to progress, receiving new riddles or achieving insights their teachers acknowledged, Ichi remained stuck with his unsolved puzzle. He watched younger monks arrive and eventually pass him in status and recognition. 55 years, he would whisper while stirring soup. 55 years and still I cannot hear what one hand sounds like when it claps. The question haunted him through every chore, every quiet moment, every season of his long service. Now, as his body grew weak, Ichi knew his time was coming to its end. He had been moved to a small attic room where he could rest away from daily noise. As he lay there in the gathering twilight of his life, something unexpected began to happen. Slowly, the familiar weight of striving began to lift from his chest. The desperate need to solve his riddle, the shame of seeming failure, the constant reaching for enlightenment. All of it slowly melted away like mist at sunrise. Gone was the fierce desire for awakening that had driven him for decades. In place of all that seeking, Ichi discovered something he had never expected. A deep peace that seemed to hold his entire being. The soft darkness felt not like defeat, but like the gentlest hug. His breathing slowed, and with it, the churning of thoughts that had occupied his mind for so many years. It was in this beautiful silence, when there remained no more questions, nor need for answers, when even the need for breathing seemed to fade into quiet acceptance, that Ichi finally heard it. The rushing silence of one hand clapping filled his mind not as a sound, but as the very nature of life itself. The sound that had been present all along beneath all the noise of seeking. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Stop cherishing opinions and you will achieve enlightenment." Here we discover that enlightenment isn't something we get through effort, but something we uncover when the effort finally stops. Why do we struggle so hard with the very seeking that prevents us from finding what we seek? The mind creates a basic split between the seeker and the sought, keeping us constantly reaching for something we imagine exists elsewhere in some future moment when we'll finally get it. Ichi's story lights up what Zen calls beginner's mind. The fresh awareness that exists before we complicate it with goals and achievements. For 55 years, he had turned simple presence into complex spiritual ambition. The more expertly he sought enlightenment, the further he moved from the naturally enlightened awareness that had been with him all along. Think about how often we create this pattern. We complicate natural joy with the pursuit of happiness. We hide natural love with the search for perfect relationships. We cover natural wisdom with endless gathering of knowledge. Ichi's realization came not through solving his riddle, but through finally letting go of the need to solve it. The sound of one hand clapping isn't a puzzle to be figured out, but an invitation to rest in the space before thinking begins. The awareness that exists before questions and answers. Tonight, as thoughts about your own spiritual journey rise, remember Ichi's deep discovery. What if the very awareness that notices your seeking is the enlightenment you've been seeking? The sound of one hand clapping might be closer than you think. In the very listening that hears all sounds, including silence. As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. Sometimes the greatest achievement is the willingness to stop achieving and simply rest in what has always been present. Let us continue on our journey with a teaching about the dangerous gap between book understanding and lived experience. This is the story of the one-eyed monk and the silent debate. In ancient China, when traveling monks walked from monastery to monastery seeking teachings and testing their understanding, a special custom had developed among Zen groups. Before a wandering monk could receive a room for the night, he had to engage in what was called spiritual debate with either the head monk or a designated representative. This wasn't physical fighting, but a contest of spiritual smarts and understanding where deep questions and strange answers revealed the depth of each person's realization. At one famous monastery nestled in bamboo forests, a travel-worn monk arrived as evening shadows began to lengthen across the courtyards. His robes were dusty from mountain paths, his straw sandals worn thin, but his eyes carried the alert brightness of someone genuinely seeking deeper understanding. The head monk, busy with evening duties, assigned his helper to handle the traditional spiritual meeting. This helper had served the monastery faithfully for many years, though he possessed what others might consider a disadvantage. He had lost one eye in an accident during his youth. Despite this physical limit, or perhaps because of the clarity it had brought to his inner vision, he had developed deep insight into the Buddha's teachings. When the two monks met in the monastery's formal meeting hall, the traveling monk proposed something unusual. "Let us engage in silent debate," he suggested, moving his hands to show they would communicate through signs alone rather than words. Sometimes the deepest truths go beyond language altogether. The helper nodded agreement, and they began their wordless exchange. The traveller raised one finger toward the ceiling, holding it steady with a look of calm confidence. Without waiting, the helper responded by raising 2 fingers. The traveling monk, seeming pleased by this response, then raised 3 fingers. At this, the helper surprised him by making a tight fist and holding it firmly in the space between them. The traveling monk's confident look faltered. For a moment he stared at the clenched fist, his face showing confusion and something approaching alarm. Then, without trying any further gestures, he bowed quickly and left the hall. Soon afterward, he found the head monk and spoke with clear respect and disappointment. "Sir, your representative is far too advanced for me. I must continue my journey rather than presume to stay in your monastery tonight." The head monk raised his eyebrows with interest. "Please tell me what happened in your exchange." "Well," the traveler explained earnestly, "I began by holding up 1 finger to symbolize the Buddha, the awakened one who showed us the path to enlightenment. But your monk immediately responded with 2 fingers showing the Buddha and the teaching, both the teacher and the lessons he offered. So I raised 3 fingers to represent the complete triple gem, the Buddha, the teaching, and the community of followers." But then he held up a clenched fist to show that all 3 are actually one unified reality. "His understanding is clearly beyond mine, so I must seek teaching elsewhere before I could be worthy of staying here." The head monk listened to this explanation with growing surprise, for he knew his helper's character well. As the traveling monk left into the gathering dusk, the helper himself appeared, visibly upset and breathing hard from running. "Where is that rude rascal?" he demanded, his single eye blazing with anger. "I've been looking everywhere for him. The nerve of that man. I've never met such rudeness disguised as spiritual questioning." "What exactly happened?" the head monk asked, genuinely curious now about what had passed between these 2 very different interpretations of the same event. "First," the helper explained, his voice rising with remembered offense, "he insulted me by holding up 1 finger to show that I had only 1 eye. Can you imagine here? I thought we were engaging in spiritual talk, but he immediately drew attention to my physical limit. Determined to remain polite despite such rudeness, I held up 2 fingers to acknowledge that he was blessed with 2 eyes. I was trying to show that I bore him no bad feelings for his thoughtless comment." The helper paused to catch his breath, his upset increasing as he continued, but the scoundrel wasn't satisfied with that insult. Next, he held up 3 fingers to rub it in further, showing that between the 2 of us, there were only 3 eyes total. He was deliberately pointing out our difference, making sure I couldn't forget my disability. That's when I'd had enough. I made a fist because I was about to hit him for his constant rudeness, but the coward saw what was coming and ran off before I could teach him proper manners. The head monk stood in stunned silence, thinking about this amazing demonstration of how 2 people could participate in identical events while living in completely different realities. The Buddha taught, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are." This profound truth reveals itself in the complete misunderstanding between our 2 monks, each of whom experienced the exact same movements while living in entirely different interpretations of reality. Why do we so often put our own concerns, insecurities, and assumptions onto neutral situations? Zen Buddhism points to what it calls the 8 worldly winds: praise and blame, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, fame and shame. These mental forces create internal weather systems that color our view of everything around us. The helper's sensitivity about his missing eye created a filter through which every gesture became a personal attack. His past experiences of being judged or pitied for his appearance had created such a strong interpretive framework that he couldn't see any other possible meaning in the traveler's hand signals. Similarly, the traveling monk's spiritual focus caused him to see profound teachings in what were actually expressions of wounded feelings and growing anger. His framework of seeking enlightened instruction made him interpret increasingly aggressive gestures as increasingly sophisticated wisdom. Look deeply at your own patterns of understanding. How often do your current worries, past hurts, or stubborn hopes cause you to misread situations completely? Perhaps someone's distracted behavior becomes evidence they don't like you when they're actually worried about a family member's health. Maybe a co-worker's helpful suggestion feels like criticism because you're unsure about your work. This ancient wisdom lights up how our internal state creates our external experience. Both monks were sincere in their perceptions, yet both were fundamentally mistaken about what was actually happening. Neither was lying or deliberately misunderstanding. They were simply seeing through the lens of their own mental training. The story points us toward a crucial question. How can we develop the ability to see situations more clearly, less filtered through our personal concerns and ideas? Zen practice offers several approaches to this challenge. First is what's called don't know mind, keeping openness to many meanings rather than immediately settling on the one that supports our existing beliefs or fears. When someone acts in a way that triggers our interpretation, can we pause and consider other possible explanations? Second is mindfulness of our own emotional states. The helper might have noticed his rising sensitivity about his appearance and recognized how this was coloring his view. The traveler might have observed his eagerness to find profound teachings and questioned whether he was seeing wisdom where none existed. Zen Master Mazu taught your everyday mind that is the way. This teaching invites us to examine the very mind that creates these meanings, rather than constantly trying to figure out the correct meaning of outside events. The Buddha said, "Hatred is never stopped by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred stopped. This is a law eternal." If the helper had met the traveler's perceived insults with curiosity rather than defensiveness, if the traveler had questioned his assumptions about enlightened behavior, their meeting might have become a true teaching for both. Tonight, as you replay conversations and meetings from your day, can you notice how your own concerns and sensitivities might have shaped your understandings? Can you sense the difference between what actually happened and the meaning your mind added to those events? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. By understanding how our internal weather creates our external storms, we discover the possibility of clear seeing that serves both wisdom and kindness. Now let us explore a Zen story about the irreplaceable nature of direct spiritual learning. This is the tale of Bankei and the messenger. In the busy capital city, where merchants bartered in crowded marketplaces and scholars debated in tea houses, the famous Zen master Bankei had completed another period of teaching at one of the great temples. Known throughout the region for his deep insight and ability to point students directly toward their Buddha nature, Bankei kept a simple practice of traveling between temples, offering instruction wherever sincere students gathered. As the master prepared to leave for his next destination, carefully folding his few belongings into a traveling bundle, a well-dressed gentleman approached him with urgent politeness. The man's fine silk robes and careful manner suggested someone used to moving in rich circles, likely a helper or aide to one of the noble families that supported the temple. "Venerable master," the gentleman said, bowing deeply. "I come with a request from the Baron, a man of great learning and true interest in your teachings. He has heard of your wisdom and wishes desperately to meet with you personally, but urgent matters have kept him today. Would you consider delaying your leaving by one day so that he might have the honor of studying with you tomorrow?" Bankei, despite his eagerness to reach the next temple where students waited for him, recognized the true need in the request. The path of a teacher required flexibility and kindness, even when inconvenient. "Of course," he replied simply, "I shall stay one more day." The master unpacked his bundle and settled back into the temple rooms, spending the evening in quiet meditation and preparation for what he expected would be a meaningful meeting with a sincere seeker. He had met many nobles over the years, who approached Zen with true humility despite their worldly status, and he looked forward to offering whatever guidance might be helpful. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the sound of temple bells, calling the community to meditation. Bankei waited in his designated meeting room as the appointed time approached. But instead of the Baron himself, the same well-dressed gentleman appeared again, this time with obvious embarrassment written across his face. "Master," the man began, his voice heavy with apology. "I bring sad news." The Baron was called away on urgent business that could not be delayed, matters of state that demanded his immediate attention. However, he has not forgotten his desire for your teaching. He has asked me to serve as his representative to receive your instruction on his behalf and carry your wisdom back to him faithfully. The gentleman paused, clearly hoping this arrangement would prove acceptable. The Baron's specific question concerns the nature of mind itself. He wishes to understand what is the true nature of consciousness and how can one realize it directly. If you would share your teaching on this matter, I promise to convey every word exactly as you speak it. Bankei listened to this request with gentle attention, his face remaining calm and kind. When the gentleman finished speaking, the master sat quietly for a moment, as if considering not just the question, but the entire situation, the absent seeker, the well-meaning messenger, and the deep impossibility of what was being asked. Finally, Bankei spoke with the usual simplicity and directness. This matter of Zen is difficult to explain, even through direct question and answer between teacher and student meeting face to face. It becomes all the more difficult, indeed, impossible to pass on through a messenger, no matter how sincere or capable that messenger might be. Having delivered this response, the master said nothing more. He simply sat in silence, showing the very teaching he had just spoken. The gentleman waited, perhaps expecting more details or other suggestions, but none came. Eventually, finding himself speechless and somewhat confused, the gentleman bowed politely and left the temple. The Buddha once said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." This deep truth reveals itself in Bankei's gentle but firm refusal to reduce Zen wisdom to a message that could be carried by someone else. Spiritual awakening cannot be passed on second hand because it is not information but change. Why do we often approach spiritual learning as if it were school knowledge that can be collected and passed through others? Zen Buddhism teaches that awakening is not an idea to be understood, but a reality to be directly experienced. Like the taste of water to someone who is thirsty, it cannot be described well enough. It must be experienced firsthand. The Baron's question about the nature of consciousness reveals our typical approach to spiritual asking. We want to understand awareness intellectually, to grasp it with ideas, to own it as knowledge. But consciousness cannot be made into an object of study because it is the very subject doing the studying. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The seeing itself is what you are trying to see. Think about how often, throughout your day, you might approach spiritual wisdom as information to be collected rather than truth to be lived. We read books about meditation instead of meditating. We study descriptions of enlightenment instead of checking our present experience. We seek answers about the nature of mind instead of directly checking what we call mind. Right now, Zen Master Dogen taught to study the Buddha, way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. This puzzle points to the heart of why spiritual teaching requires direct engagement. The self that wants to understand Buddhism intellectually is the very thing that must be seen through. This seeing through happens not through gathering knowledge, but through close checking of immediate experience. The messenger in the story represents our own tendency to approach awakening indirectly. We want to understand consciousness from a safe distance, keeping the dream that we are separate watchers, studying an object called awareness. But awareness is what we are not what we have. It cannot be owned, understood, or passed on because we are expressions of it. Bankei's silence after his brief explanation was itself a teaching. In Zen, silence often says what words cannot. The gaps between thoughts, the space between breaths, the awareness in which all experiences happen, these cannot be captured in language, but can be directly recognized when we stop trying to grasp them with ideas. This doesn't mean spiritual teaching is impossible or that teachers serve no purpose. Rather, it means that real teaching points students toward their own direct experience, rather than providing second-hand descriptions of someone else's realization. The teacher's role is not to deliver enlightenment, but to create conditions where students might recognize what they already are. Tonight, as you experience the simple fact of being conscious, aware of these words, aware of your body, aware of the space in which thoughts and feelings appear, can you check this awareness directly rather than through ideas? Can you be present to your experience rather than trying to understand it through someone else's descriptions? As the Buddha taught, work out your own freedom with hard work. The path to freedom cannot be walked by someone else. It requires your own feet, your own breath, your own willingness to look directly at what you have always been, but perhaps never clearly seen. Now let us explore a story about the difference between giving in and real understanding. This is the lesson of the proud priest and the gentle master. Master Bankei had gained quite a reputation throughout the region. Unlike other teachers who filled their talks with complex arguments and long quotes from ancient texts, Bankei spoke directly from his heart to the hearts of his listeners. His words were simple but deep, accessible to farmers and scholars alike. People from all walks of life, merchants, servants, samurai, and monks gathered to hear him speak about the natural peace that exists within every person. The master's growing popularity began to trouble a priest from the Nichiren group, whose own temple had grown noticeably emptier as his followers left to hear about Zen. This priest had built his identity around being learned, respected, and obeyed. He prided himself on his knowledge of scriptures and his ability to win religious arguments. The idea that a simple Zen teacher could attract his devoted followers with plain speaking felt like a personal insult. Determined to expose what he assumed must be shallow teaching disguised as wisdom, the Nichiren priest stormed into one of Bankei's gatherings. He pushed through the crowd of seated listeners, his robes blowing dramatically, his face stern with righteous anger. The peaceful atmosphere of quiet attention was suddenly charged with tension as people turned to see what was happening. "Hey, Zen teacher!" the priest called out loudly, his voice echoing through the hall. The deliberate rudeness of his speech was unmistakable. He was treating the revered master like a common street performer. "Wait just a minute. I have something to say to you." Bankei looked up calmly from where he sat, showing no sign of irritation or defensiveness at the interruption. His eyes held the same gentle attention he gave to every person who approached him, whether they came with genuine questions or hostile challenges. "All these people here respect you and will obey whatever you say," the priest continued, his voice growing louder as he warmed to his challenge. "But a man like myself does not respect you at all. Can you make me obey you? Can your so-called wisdom force someone who sees through your simple tricks?" The crowd held its breath, expecting either an angry response or a learned comeback that would put this proud challenger in his place. Instead, Bankei smiled with what appeared to be true warmth and curiosity. "Please come up beside me," the master said gently, "and I will show you." The priest, feeling winning that he had provoked a response and confident in his ability to expose whatever trick was about to unfold, proudly pushed his way through the crowd to the front of the hall. He stood beside the master's simple cushion, his chest puffed out with self-importance, ready to show his independence from this supposed authority. "Thank you," Bankei said with the same gentle smile. "Now we might hear each other better if you come over to my left side. Please step over here." Without thinking, the priest moved to Bankei's left side. It seemed like a reasonable request after all. "Actually," Bankei continued thoughtfully, "perhaps we could speak more clearly if you were on my right side instead. Would you mind stepping over there?" Again, the priest complied automatically. It was such a small, sensible adjustment that he didn't even notice he was following instructions. Bankei's smile deepened, his eyes twinkling with gentle fun. "You see," he observed quietly, "you are already obeying me, and I think you are actually a very gentle, cooperative person. Now please sit down and listen to what I have to share." The priest stood frozen, suddenly realizing what had just happened. He had come to show his independence and superiority, but had instead revealed his natural willingness to respond helpfully to kind, reasonable requests. His whole argument had dissolved, not through force or clever words, but through his own unconscious behavior. The crowd remained silent, but many people were struggling not to smile. They had witnessed something amazing. Not a defeat or shame, but a gentle showing. The master had shown that true influence comes not from demanding obedience, but from inviting natural cooperation. The priest felt his anger and pride melting away, replaced by something he hadn't expected, curiosity. How had this simple man accomplished what felt like magic? How had he transformed a hostile fight into a moment of mutual understanding, without ever raising his voice or asserting his power? Still somewhat dazed by the experience, the priest sat down. As Bankei began to speak again, the words seemed to bypass his analytical mind and speak directly to his heart. For the first time in years, he listened not to find mistakes or prepare counter-arguments, but simply to hear what was being offered. Buddha's wisdom tells us, true obedience is not blind giving in, but conscious harmony. This ancient wisdom lights up the difference between the compliance that comes from fear or social pressure and the natural cooperation that arises from real understanding. Why do we so often confuse authority with forcing people to obey, influence with force? Zen Buddhism points to our training around power. We assume that getting others to cooperate requires force, tricks, or the assertion of superiority. But the deepest teaching here shows us that true leadership comes from understanding human nature, not from overpowering it. The priest came expecting to meet someone who would try to control him, because that was the only model of authority he knew. When instead, he met someone who simply invited his natural cooperativeness. His entire framework for understanding power and influence was gently challenged. Think about your own experiences with authority. The teachers, bosses, or leaders who most positively influenced your life. Did they demand your respect through force, or did they earn it by appealing to your better nature? The difference is huge. Forced compliance creates anger and resistance, while invited cooperation creates real change. In our daily relationships, we often fall into the same trap as the priest. We approach conflicts assuming we need to overpower others to get what we want. We prepare arguments, gather our defenses, and ready ourselves for battle. But Bankei's approach suggests a different possibility. What if we assumed the best about others and invited their natural wisdom to emerge? Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "When another person makes you suffer, it is because he suffers deeply within himself, and his suffering is spilling over." The priest's anger came from his own insecurity and fear of being replaced. Bankei's genius lay in seeing past the hostile surface to the suffering underneath, then responding to the suffering rather than the aggression. This doesn't mean being passive or allowing ourselves to be mistreated. Bankei kept clear boundaries and didn't submit to the priest's demands for a debate. Instead, he redirected the energy of the encounter towards something more helpful. He transformed a potential power struggle into a teaching moment. The Buddha taught, hatred is never stopped by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred stopped. This is a law eternal. This rule applies not just to obvious hatred, but to all forms of resistance and conflict. When we meet resistance with resistance, we simply create more tension. When we meet resistance with understanding, we create space for change. Tonight, as you consider the relationships and situations in your life where you feel the need to push your will or defend your position, can you remember the gentle master who never commanded obedience, yet received complete cooperation? Can you find ways to invite others' natural wisdom, rather than trying to overpower their resistance? As the Buddha observed, in separation lies the world's greatest misery. In kindness lies the world's true strength. True authority comes not from the power to make others obey, but from the wisdom to help them discover their own desire to cooperate in creating something beautiful together. Let us keep going on our journey. The following story reveals the difference between helping and holding on. This is the lesson of the two monks and the woman at the river. Two monks were traveling together along a mountain path, making their way to a distant monastery where they planned to continue their studies. Both were dedicated practitioners who had taken strict promises as part of their spiritual training, including a promise to avoid all physical contact with women. This wasn't born from disrespect, but from their understanding that such discipline helped maintain focus on their spiritual development. As they approached a swollen river where the usual bridge had been broken by recent storms, they met a young woman standing unsure at the water's edge. The current was strong and dangerous, filled with debris from the mountain runoff, and she was clearly afraid to try crossing alone. "Please, honored monks," she called to them. "Could one of you help me cross this dangerous water? I'm not strong enough to make it safely on my own." One of the monks immediately tensed, his mind racing through their monastic rules and the potential problems of this situation. Physical contact with women was clearly forbidden, and he began thinking of explanations for why they couldn't help. Perhaps suggestions for other solutions that wouldn't require breaking their promises. The other monk, however, took one look at the woman's problem and the real danger she faced, and made a different choice. Without waiting or long thinking, he walked to her side and gently lifted her onto his shoulders. He carried her carefully across the dangerous current, ensuring her safety with each step, and set her down gently on the far bank. "Thank you so much," she said gratefully, bowing to both monks before continuing on her way. The two monks resumed their journey, but the feeling between them had changed deeply. The first monk walked in increasingly upset silence, his mind churning with thoughts about what he had seen. As the hours passed, his internal tension grew until finally he could no longer contain his distress. "Brother!" he burst out, unable to hold his silence any longer. "I cannot understand your behavior back at the river. Our spiritual training explicitly teaches us to avoid any physical contact with women. Yet you picked that woman up onto your shoulders and carried her across the water. How could you so clearly break our sacred promises?" His companion looked at him with gentle surprise and responded with perfect simplicity. "Brother, I set her down on the other side of the river hours ago, but you are still carrying her. Buddha's wisdom teaches us holding on to anger is like holding a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned." This tale shows the deep difference between kind action and mental attachment, between responding to present needs and carrying past events. Why do we often carry situations long after they've ended, replaying scenes and nursing grievances that only exist in our own minds? Zen Buddhism reveals that much of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our inability to release experiences once they've passed. The first monk's upset demonstrates how strict following of rules can sometimes conflict with the kind spirit that inspired those rules originally. His fellow monk saw a person in danger and responded with immediate kindness, then completely released the event. But the first monk carried the event for hours, letting it grow heavier with each step. Think about your own tendency to replay past conversations, nurse old grievances, or mentally practice scenes that have already ended. How much of your mental energy goes toward carrying situations that exist now only in memory? The woman crossed the river in minutes, but the monk carried her for hours through his own thoughts. This teaching applies to far more than dramatic breaking of rules. We carry harsh words someone spoke years ago, mistakes we made decades past, embarrassing moments that no one else even remembers. Meanwhile, the present moment, rich with possibility and actual experience, goes unnoticed because we're too busy carrying ghosts from the past. In Zen practice, we learn to tell the difference between appropriate action and unnecessary attachment. The second monk helped when help was needed, then moved on completely. He didn't dwell on whether he'd made the right choice, worry about others' opinions, or replay the event endlessly in his mind. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to things changing, everything is possible. The river crossing was temporary. It began, served its purpose, and ended. Only the first monk's attachment to the event gave it ongoing existence in the form of mental suffering. The Buddha said, "Let go of what has passed. Let go of what may come. Let go of what is happening now. Don't try to figure anything out. Don't try to make anything happen. Relax right now and rest." This teaching points directly to the freedom available when we stop carrying experiences beyond their natural lifespan. Look deeply at what you might be carrying unnecessarily. Old angers, past failures, conversations that upset you, decisions you regret. All of these exist now only because you continue to pick them up and carry them. What would it feel like to set them down? The irony is huge. The monk who actually broke the rule experienced no suffering from it, while the monk who maintained perfect rule following created hours of upset for himself. This reveals that suffering often comes not from our actions, but from our thoughts about our actions. Tonight, as you notice your mind returning to past events, old grievances, or situations that have already ended, can you remember the wise monk's example? Can you practice setting down whatever you've been carrying unnecessarily, discovering the lightness that comes from traveling through life without the burden of yesterday's experiences? As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, only three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. True spiritual practice isn't about perfect rule following, but about responding properly to what's actually present, then releasing it completely to make space for whatever comes next. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a teaching about the temporary nature of all our belongings and positions. This is the story of the inn that calls itself a palace. In ancient India, a famous spiritual teacher had spent many years traveling from village to village, sharing the Buddha's teachings with anyone who would listen. His reputation for wisdom and kindness had spread throughout the land, reaching even the ears of kings and nobles. One day during his travels, he arrived at the capital city of a great kingdom, where a huge palace rose above the busy streets like a jeweled crown. The palace was truly a wonder to see. Its walls were made of the finest marble, set with precious stones that caught and reflected the sunlight in brilliant showers of color. Gardens filled with exotic flowers and flowing fountains surrounded the building, and guards in shining armor stood at attention throughout the grounds. It was clearly the home of someone who commanded huge wealth and power. The spiritual teacher approached the main entrance with the same calm dignity he brought to every meeting, whether with kings or beggars. The guards, recognizing him by his simple robes and peaceful presence, made no move to stop him. Word of his arrival had come before him, and they had been told to allow him entry. Walking through halls lined with silk hangings and golden statues, the teacher made his way directly to the throne room, where the king sat upon a carved chair raised above the marble floor. People in fine clothes gathered around the throne, their jeweled decorations shining in the light from tall windows. The king, a middle-aged man wearing robes of deep purple silk and a crown of gold and diamonds, looked up as the teacher entered. He had been expecting this visit, though he wasn't entirely sure what to expect from their meeting. "What do you want?" the king asked directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to immediate answers and unquestioning obedience. The teacher bowed respectfully, but spoke with quiet confidence. "Your Majesty, I would like a place to sleep in this inn." A ripple of surprise moved through the gathered people. The king's eyebrows rose and his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "But this is not an inn," the king replied, pointing to the fancy surroundings. "This is my palace. I am the ruler of this kingdom, and this has been the seat of royal power for generations." The teacher nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information carefully. "I see. May I ask your Majesty who owned this palace before you?" "My father," the king replied, his tone becoming slightly defensive. "He ruled here for 30 years before his death. This palace was his seat of power as it is now mine." "Ah," the teacher said with true interest. "And who owned it before him?" "My grandfather," the king answered. beginning to sense where these questions might lead. He too ruled from this throne. He also is dead. The teacher paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle in the huge throne room. The people had grown quiet, sensing the deep direction of this unusual conversation. Even the king found himself waiting, almost despite himself, for the teacher's response. Finally, the teacher spoke with gentle clarity that seemed to fill every corner of the fancy room, and this place where people live for a short time and then move on. "Did I hear you say that it is not an inn?" The silence that followed was complete. The king sat motionless on his throne, the teacher's words cutting through layers of assumption and identity he had never questioned. The people remained frozen, as if watching something beyond their normal understanding of royal rules and worldly power. The Buddha taught, "All made things are temporary. Work out your freedom with hard work." This deep truth reveals itself in the teacher's sharp question about the inn that calls itself a palace. Why do we hold on so fiercely to things and roles that are by their very nature temporary? Zen Buddhism explains that our holding on to permanence creates suffering because it fights with the basic reality of change. Everything we think we own, including our own bodies and identities, we hold only for a while. Look deeply at your own experience, the house you call yours, the car you drive, the job title you carry, the bank account balance you check. All of these are temporary arrangements. You live in them for a period of time, then move on, just as others lived in them before you and will live in them after you. This doesn't mean we should become uncaring to our duties or careless with our things. Rather, it invites us to hold them more lightly, recognizing their short nature. The king's palace was indeed huge and served important functions, but it was also clearly an inn where people stayed temporarily before leaving. The deeper teaching here shows us how identification with temporary roles creates unnecessary suffering. When we forget the temporary nature of our positions, whether as parent, worker, homeowner, or even student of Zen, we create anxiety trying to keep what cannot be permanently kept. Think about your own attachments. Perhaps it's your work identity, your relationships, your health, or your spiritual achievements. Each of these is precious and worthy of care. But each is also subject to change. The boss becomes retired. The parent becomes empty nester. The student becomes teacher. The healthy person faces illness. These changes are not failures, but natural expressions of change. Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to things changing, everything is possible." This teaching reframes change from something to fear into something to celebrate, because nothing lasts forever. Suffering states can transform into joy. Closed hearts can open to love, and even the most stuck patterns can shift toward wisdom. In Zen practice, we grow what's called non-attachment, caring deeply while holding lightly. This doesn't mean we become cold or uncaring, but that we learn to love without gripping, to work without grabbing, and to enjoy without demanding. It lasts forever. The spiritual teacher's insight cuts through the dream that any of us are permanent owners of anything. We are all temporary guests in the inn of life, borrowing our roles and things for the short time we live in them. This recognition can bring either sadness or deep freedom, depending on how we receive it. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Everything is temporary. Try to accomplish as much good as possible." This teaching encourages us not to waste our temporary time in the inn, but to use it wisely, growing love, wisdom, and kindness while we have the chance. Tonight, as you rest in your own temporary home, surrounded by your own temporary things, can you feel the deep freedom that comes with recognizing their short nature? Can you sense how this recognition might actually increase your appreciation rather than lessen it? As the Buddha taught, of all footprints that of the elephant is biggest. Similarly, of all meditation themes, that on death is biggest. By remembering the temporary nature of our stay in this inn called life, we discover the urgency and preciousness of each moment we're given, to practice love and awareness as we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism. Let us explore a story about transforming our relationship with suffering. This is the tale of the salt and the lake. In a quiet monastery nestled among rolling hills, there lived an old master known for his patience and wisdom. Among his students was a young beginner whose heart had become heavy with complaints about life's difficulties. Each morning, the beginner would arrive with fresh grievances. "Master, why is life so hard? Yesterday, my meditation was disturbed by noise. Today, my back aches from the hard floor. When will this suffering end?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had listed every small discomfort until they had grown into an overwhelming burden. The master listened with infinite patience, but as days turned to weeks, he recognized that words alone would not shift his student's view. One crisp morning, as golden sunlight streamed through their simple dwelling, the master made an unusual request. "My dear student," he said gently, "I need you to go to the kitchen and bring me some salt. Just a handful will do." The beginner, puzzled by the simple task, nonetheless obeyed. He returned with cupped palms holding rough white crystals. "Now," the master instructed, producing a small glass of water. "Place all of that salt into this glass and drink it." The young man hesitated. "Master, that seems like far too much salt for such a small amount of water." "Trust the process," the master replied. "Drink." The beginner poured the salt into the glass, watching the crystals disappear into a cloudy, gross mixture. He lifted it to his lips and took a large gulp, immediately making a face as the strongly bitter taste filled his mouth. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Bitter!" the beginner spat. "Terribly, overwhelmingly bitter. I can barely stand it." The master chuckled softly. "Excellent. Now bring that same amount of salt and come with me." Together, they walked in quiet silence until they reached the shores of a clean mountain lake. The water stretched before them like a mirror, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where earth ended and heaven began. "Now," the master said, "place this handful of salt into the lake." The beginner walked into the shallow water and opened his hands, watching as the salt crystals scattered across the lake's surface, quickly disappearing without leaving any visible trace. "Drink from the lake," the master instructed. The young man cupped the lake water in his hands and brought it to his lips. The water was clean, refreshing, with the pure taste of mountain streams. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Much better," the beginner replied, genuinely surprised. "Clean and pure." "Do you taste the salt?" the master asked gently. The student paused, paying careful attention. "No," he said slowly. "I don't taste any salt at all." The master sat beside his student on a smooth stone at the water's edge. His worn hands reached out to hold the young man's hands in deep kindness. "My dear student," the master said, "the pain of life is pure salt. No more, no less. The amount of pain in existence stays the same. But the amount of bitterness we feel depends entirely on the container we put that pain into." The beginner listened with new understanding. "When you are in pain," the master continued, "the only thing you can truly control is your response. You can choose to be a small glass where every grain of salt overwhelms your senses. Or you can choose to make your sense of things bigger, to become like this huge lake where the same salt disappears harmlessly into something much greater." The master paused. "Stop being a glass, my friend. Become a lake." The Buddha once said, "Pain is certain, suffering is optional." This basic teaching reveals the heart of our relationship with difficulty. We cannot remove the challenges woven into human life, but we have huge power over how that pain affects us. What comes from this story is understanding about mind itself. Our awareness is not fixed in size. It can shrink into the narrow limits of a glass where every difficulty looms enormous, or it can expand into the wideness of a lake where the same difficulties become manageable. Why do we often choose to be the glass rather than the lake? First is our tendency toward focusing too close on pain, becoming so focused on discomfort that it fills our entire mind. Second is our habit of story growing, taking a single painful event and creating detailed stories about how unfair life is. Third is the comparing mind, measuring our pain against an imaginary standard of how life should be. The lake view doesn't minimize real pain or suggest being passive. Rather, it offers a skillful way of relating to unavoidable challenges that doesn't make them worse with unnecessary suffering. From lake consciousness, we can respond to problems more creatively because we're not overwhelmed, Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught. Thanks to things changing, everything is possible. From the lake view, we remember that everything happens and passes away within the huge space of awareness. Today's crisis becomes tomorrow's memory. We become a lake through practices that naturally grow awareness. Meditation teaches us to rest in open presence. Gratitude helps us notice experiences beyond immediate difficulties. Service reminds us that our pain is part of shared human experience. Tonight, as you think on current challenges, can you sense the difference between experiencing them from glass mind versus lake mind? What would it feel like to allow your awareness to grow beyond the immediate strength of difficulties to include the huge context of this moment? As the Buddha taught, if you want to know your mind, sit down and watch it. If your mind is clear, happiness will come. The clarity he speaks of is not the absence of salt, but the room to hold it skillfully. In becoming lakes, rather than glasses, we discover that pain can become a gateway to deeper kindness and freedom. Now let us explore a story about the power of belief and the destiny we create through faith itself. This is the tale of the general and the coin that revealed truth. A Japanese general faced an impossible situation. His army was greatly outnumbered by enemy forces. The ground favored his opponents, and by every normal measure of war strategy, the coming battle should result in terrible defeat. Yet something deep within him remained convinced that victory was possible. Perhaps it was a feeling. Perhaps it was desperate hope. But he felt sure that his cause was just, and his troops, though fewer in number, possessed a fighting spirit that could overcome the odds. The problem was his soldiers. They could count as well as he could, and they had eyes to see the huge force arrayed against them. Fear rippled through their ranks like a sickness. Doubt clouded their faces. Whispered conversations filled with gloom spread through the camp, and the general could sense that their spirit was breaking before the battle had even begun. He knew that an army convinced of its own defeat would indeed be defeated. Regardless of any other factors, skill, better weapons, even more numbers means nothing when soldiers have already surrendered in their hearts. But an army that truly believed in its victory could accomplish seemingly impossible things through the sheer force of that belief. On the morning of the battle, as they marched toward their destiny, the general led his troops to a small religious shrine that stood beside the road. This was a place where countless warriors had stopped over the centuries to pray before facing uncertain fate. The general gathered his men around him and led them in serious prayer, asking for divine blessing and protection in the coming fight. When the prayers were finished, the general reached into his pocket and took out a simple coin. He held it high so that every soldier could see it clearly. "My brothers," he called out, his voice carrying across the gathered ranks. "We have prayed, and now we will let heaven itself show our destiny. I will toss this coin into the air. If it lands heads, we are fated to win this battle. If it lands tails, we are destined to lose. Let us discover what the gods have decided for us." The soldiers pressed closer, their breathing shallow with excitement. Everything seemed to depend on this single moment, this one flip of metal spinning through the morning air. The general tossed the coin high, and every eye followed its arc as it rose. Hung suspended for an instant against the sky, then fell back down to earth. The coin landed and lay still in the dust. It was heads. A cheer erupted from the troops that could probably be heard for miles. Soldiers who had been grim and fearful moments before now laughed with joy and hugged each other with renewed confidence. The gods had spoken. Victory was sure. Their cause was blessed by heaven itself. Filled with this divine confidence, the soldiers attacked their enemies with such fierce determination and combined power that they achieved exactly what the coin had predicted. Against all odds, they won a clear victory, beating forces much larger than their own and securing a win that would be remembered for generations. After the battle, as the general walked among his celebrating troops, his lieutenant approached him with wonder in his eyes. "General," the lieutenant said, "what an incredible thing. The coin showed our true destiny, just as you said it would. Surely no human power can change what heaven has decided." "You are absolutely right," the general replied with a knowing smile. He reached into his pocket and took out the coin, holding it so his lieutenant could check it closely. "No one can change destiny." The lieutenant looked at the coin and gasped. Both sides showed heads. The Buddha once said, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become." Here we discover the deep truth that destiny is not something that happens to us, but something we create through the power of our own beliefs and expectations. Why do we so easily assume that fate is beyond our influence when our own minds play such a key role in shaping what unfolds? Zen Buddhism teaches that while we cannot control all outside circumstances, we have huge power over the internal conditions that decide how we respond to whatever happens. The general understood something deep about human thinking and the nature of reality itself. He knew that his soldiers' belief in victory was more important than their number disadvantage. He recognized that confidence, determination, and fighting spirit could overcome more numbers when those qualities were truly present. But here's the deeper teaching. The general didn't simply trick his troops through lie. He created the conditions that allowed their natural courage and strength to emerge. The soldiers possessed the ability to fight brilliantly all along. They simply needed to believe in themselves and their cause. Think about your own relationship with destiny and possibility. How often do you assume that outcomes are decided beforehand, that success or failure is beyond your influence? The general's two-headed coin represents the power we all possess to tip the scales in favor of good outcomes through the quality of our engagement with life. This doesn't mean we can control everything through positive thinking, or that believing in something makes it automatically true. The soldiers still had to fight the battle. They still had to show actual skill and courage, but their belief in victory created the mental conditions that allowed their best qualities to show. In Zen practice, we learn to work skillfully with both effort and letting go, both intention and acceptance. We recognize that while we cannot dictate specific outcomes, we can deeply influence the energy and attention we bring to any situation. This quality of engagement often decides whether we experience success or failure, regardless of outside circumstances. Zen master Huangbo taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." The general was wise enough to see that his soldiers' thoughts about the battle were more influential than their thoughts about their number disadvantage. He worked with the reality of thinking rather than fighting against it. Look deeply at the various challenges and opportunities in your own life. Where might you be carrying a tails attitude? Assuming defeat before you fully engaged, focusing on obstacles rather than possibilities, letting fear determine your level of effort. And where might you need to create your own two-headed coin? A practice or view that consistently points you toward positive engagement regardless of circumstances. The Buddha taught, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This isn't magic thinking, but recognition of the creative power of mind itself. When we approach situations with true confidence, clarity, and commitment, we often discover abilities we didn't know we possessed. Tonight, as you consider the battles you're facing and the outcomes you're hoping for, can you find your own version of the general's wisdom? Can you create inner conditions that support your highest possibilities rather than your deepest fears? Can you recognize that while you cannot control destiny, you have deep influence over the beliefs and attitudes that shape how destiny unfolds through you? Buddha's wisdom reminds us thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. The general's confidence lit the flame of belief in every soldier's heart. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is create the conditions that allow others and ourselves to discover the strength that was there all along. Let us now turn to a story about the relationship between outer circumstances and inner growth. This is the tale of the horse and the mind in a far mountain region where execution grounds served as serious reminders of death. Zen Master Bankei sought to test the depth of his spiritual realization. For several nights, he sat in meditation beneath a wooden cross, using the nearness of death to penetrate more deeply into the nature of life. After finishing this hard retreat, Bankei made his way to a nearby area where he could rest. He found a peaceful spot on a wall surrounding a horse pen where he lay down to continue his thinking under the open sky. As he rested there, absorbed in deep silence, a harsh sound shattered his peace. From within the pen came the violent sounds of a warrior brutally beating his horse. The animal's cries mixed with the sharp crack of a whip and angry shouts of a man losing control. Master Bankei watched this scene with growing worry. The warrior was clearly frustrated, taking out his inner upset on the innocent animal. Each blow seemed to make the horse more upset rather than more compliant, creating a bad cycle of violence and resistance. Unable to remain silent, Bankei called out from his position. "Hey, what do you think you are doing?" The warrior, lost in rage, ignored the interruption and continued his harsh treatment. The beating got worse, and so did Bankei's worry for both the animal and the man degrading himself through such cruelty. "Hey!" Bankei called out again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years growing inner peace. "What do you think you are doing?" Still, the warrior continued, lost in frustration and anger. The horse became increasingly scared, which only seemed to fuel the man's determination to force compliance through violence. A third time, Bankei's voice rang out. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" This time, something in the master's tone reached the warrior's rage. The man stopped his beating, climbed down from his horse, and approached the wall. As he drew closer, his face changed. There was something about this stranger that commanded respect, a quality of presence that spoke of deep inner growth. "You were yelling at me," the warrior said, his voice still carrying traces of anger, but now mixed with curiosity. "Do you have something to tell me?" Bankei looked at the man with kindness, seeing not an enemy, but someone caught in the same cycles of frustration that trap us all. His response was simple, yet deep. Rather than beat your horse for being wild, why not scold yourself and train your own mind, right? The words hung in the air between them like a bridge connecting two very different approaches to dealing with difficulty. The warrior had been trying to solve his problem through outside force and control. Bankei was pointing to an entirely different possibility. As the Buddha observed, conquer anger with non-anger, conquer badness with goodness, conquer meanness with generosity, conquer dishonesty with truth. This teaching captures the heart of what Bankei offered the frustrated warrior. The recognition that our outer struggles mirror our inner state. What comes from this story is the deep insight that we cannot successfully force the world to fit our expectations through aggression or control. The warrior's approach, beating the horse into submission, represents how we often try to manage difficult circumstances in our own lives. We become frustrated with outside conditions and respond with force, criticism, or manipulation, never recognizing that the real work lies within. Why do we naturally blame outside circumstances for our frustration? Buddhist psychology explains that the untrained mind seeks to maintain its comfort by controlling its environment rather than growing the flexibility to respond skillfully to whatever arises. This creates what Zen calls pushing the river, exhausting ourselves. trying to force reality to match our preferences. Think about how this pattern shows up in daily life. The computer that crashes during an important project becomes the target of our anger, when the real issue is our attachment to having technology work perfectly. The traffic jam that makes us late triggers road rage, when the actual problem is our expectation that travel should always be smooth. The family member who doesn't respond to our advice becomes the focus of our frustration, when the deeper issue is our need to control others' choices. In each case, we're like the warrior beating the horse, applying force to outside circumstances while ignoring the internal conditions that create our suffering. The horse represents the uncontrollable aspects of life, other people's behavior, natural events, technological failures, and the built-in unpredictability of life. Zen teacher Pema Chodron writes, "You are the sky. Everything else is just the weather." This points to the same truth Bankei offered the warrior. Instead of trying to control the weather of outside circumstances, we can grow the open awareness that remains calm regardless of conditions. The real training involves learning to work with our own minds, rather than trying to force compliance from the world around us. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful situations, but rather approaching challenges from a place of inner stability rather than reactive frustration. Buddhist practice offers specific techniques for this internal training. Mindfulness meditation teaches us to watch our reactive patterns without being swept away by them. Loving kindness practice grows compassion for ourselves and others when things don't go as planned. Thinking about change helps us accept the changeable nature of all conditions. Tonight, as you meet the unavoidable frustrations of daily life, can you remember Bankei's teaching? When you find yourself wanting to beat the horse of difficult circumstances, can you pause and ask, what would it mean to train my own mind instead? Buddha's wisdom teaches us hatred is never stopped by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred stopped. This is a law eternal. The path to peace lies not in conquering outside conditions, but in growing the inner qualities that remain stable regardless of what the world presents. Our next story reveals the power of returning to what is real when fear threatens to overwhelm us. This is the tale of the captured warrior. In ancient Japan, during a time of constant war between rival clans, a skilled warrior found himself on the losing side of a fierce battle. As his friends fell around him and defeat became certain, he was captured by enemy soldiers and dragged away from the battlefield. His armor stripped, his weapons taken. That evening, they threw him into a dark, small prison cell with stone walls that seemed to press in from all sides. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through his bones. As darkness settled over the prison, the warrior's mind began to race with terrifying possibilities. Tomorrow, they would come for him. He knew the customs of war. First would come the questioning, designed to extract information about his lord's defenses, troop movements, and strategic plans. When he refused to speak, as honor demanded, they would resort to torture. Hot iron, bamboo splinters under his fingernails, methods he had heard described in hushed tones by other warriors. And when they had extracted what they could, or when they grew tired of his silence, would come the execution. As these thoughts consumed him, his heart began to pound so violently he feared it might burst. His breathing became shallow and fast. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. Sleep seemed impossible as his mind imagined increasingly vivid scenes of tomorrow's suffering. Hours passed in this torment. The warrior paced his small cell, sat against the cold stone wall, lay on the straw-covered floor. Nothing brought relief from the visions of coming doom that played repeatedly in his mind like a terrible dream he couldn't escape. Then, in the depths of his despair, he remembered the gentle voice of his Zen master back at the monastery where he had studied before becoming a warrior. The old teacher's words came to him as clearly as if the master was sitting beside him in the cell. Tomorrow is not real. It is a dream. The only reality is now. At first, The warrior's frightened mind fought these words. How could tomorrow be a dream when the threats were so solid, so certain? But as he sat quietly and allowed the teaching to sink deeper, something began to shift. He noticed his breathing. In this moment, he was breathing freely. He felt the straw beneath him, rough, but not uncomfortable. He heard the sound of wind moving through the trees outside his window, a sound that spoke of the natural world continuing its ancient rhythms, regardless of human conflict. In this moment, he was not being tortured. In this moment, he was not dying. In this moment, there was simply a man sitting in a cell, alive and aware. The terrors that had seemed so huge moments before revealed themselves to be nothing more than thoughts about a future that existed only in his imagination. As this understanding deepened, a deep peace settled over the warrior. His breathing slowed and deepened. His racing heart found a steady rhythm. For the first time since his capture, he smiled. The master's wisdom had freed him from a prison far more trapping than the stone walls around him, the prison of anxious thoughts about tomorrow. Within minutes, the warrior fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The Buddha once said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." This ancient wisdom lights up the deep truth the warrior discovered in his cell. The only moment in which we ever actually live is this one. Why do we torture ourselves with endless scenes about the future? Zen Buddhism explains that our minds evolved as survival tools, constantly scanning for threats and planning for protection. While this ability serves us in genuine emergencies, it becomes a source of suffering when we mistake mental pictures for reality. Look deeply at your own experience. How much of your anxiety stems from vivid imaginings of future scenes that may never happen? The presentation you're worried about, the medical test results you're awaiting, the difficult conversation you need to have. These situations exist primarily in thought, not in present reality. The warrior's teaching shows us that we can accept future challenges without being consumed by them. Planning and preparation have their place, but when they transform into constant worry, they rob us of peace and clarity. As Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to things changing, everything is possible. The future remains unwritten, shaped by causes and conditions we cannot fully predict or control. The worried mind assumes that current difficulties will inevitably continue or worsen, but change teaches us that everything changes. The warrior in his cell could not know what the next day would actually bring. Perhaps his lord's forces would mount a rescue. Perhaps his captors would show mercy. Perhaps diplomatic talks would secure his release. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "The past is gone. The future is not yet here, and there is only one moment for you to live." This teaching doesn't encourage us to ignore future duties or avoid reasonable planning. Instead, it invites us to recognize where our attention usually goes and to gently guide it back to the richness of present experience. In Zen practice, we grow what's called beginner's mind, approaching each moment with fresh awareness rather than decided anxiety. When we truly inhabit the present, we often discover that it contains resources for peace and clarity that worried thinking never revealed. Think about how the warrior's shift in attention changed his entire experience. The same cell, the same uncertain future. But by returning to present moment awareness, suffering transformed into peace. This change is available to us in every moment of anxiety or fear. Tonight, as you notice your mind creating stories about tomorrow's challenges, remember the captured warrior and his master's wisdom. What is actually happening right now? What simple experiences, breathing, sitting, the temperature of the air are available to anchor you in reality rather than imagination? As the Buddha taught, do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. In this teaching lies the key to the warrior's prison and our own. Now let us explore a story about fearlessness and the power that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. This is the meeting between the general and the Zen master, who could not be moved. During the violent civil wars that tore through feudal Japan, armies swept across the countryside like natural disasters, taking villages and controlling lands through force and fear. When word spread that a particular warlord's army was coming, most people would run with whatever things they could carry, seeking safety in the mountains or with relatives in distant towns. In one small village, as the dreaded army drew near, the familiar pattern repeated itself. Families packed quickly, merchants closed their shops, and within hours, the streets that had been busy with daily life stood empty and silent. Everyone had fled. Everyone, that is, except the old Zen master who lived in the simple temple at the village center. When the conquering army arrived and found the village empty, the general was surprised to discover smoke still rising from the temple chimney. Curious about who would have the boldness, or perhaps the foolishness, to remain when everyone else had fled, he decided to check this odd thing personally. The general approached the temple with several of his lieutenants, expecting to find either a weak old man too weak to flee, or perhaps someone who had been unable to escape in time. What he found instead was the Zen master sitting peacefully in his garden, tending to his plants as if nothing unusual was happening around him. The general had grown used to fear and giving in wherever his army went. Village leaders would bow themselves before him, begging for mercy and offering gifts in hopes of avoiding destruction. Citizens would cower and run at the mere sight of his soldiers. This old man's calm indifference to his presence was both puzzling and annoying. When he wasn't treated with the respect and submissiveness to which he was used, the general's face darkened with growing anger. Here was someone who didn't seem to understand the seriousness of the situation or respect the power he represented. "You fool!" the general shouted, his voice echoing through the empty courtyard as he reached for his sword. His fancy armor shone menacingly in the afternoon light, and his hand gripped his weapon with practiced ease. "Don't you realize that you are standing before a man who could run you through without blinking an eye?" The threat that had terrorized countless others left the master completely unmoved. He continued his careful tending of a small flowering bush, his hands steady and his face calm. When he finally looked up at the general, it was with the same calm attention he had shown before, as if greeting any ordinary visitor to his garden. "And do you realize," the master replied with perfect calmness, "that you are standing before a man who can be run through without blinking an eye?" The general stood speechless, his sword half drawn, his anger suddenly melted into something approaching awe. In all his years of war and conquest, he had met many forms of courage. The desperate bravery of cornered soldiers, the angry rage of defeated enemies, the foolish boldness of young warriors. But he had never met anything like this: complete acceptance without fear, total peace in the face of death. The master's response revealed something the general had never considered: that there could be a power greater than the ability to kill. And that was the complete absence of fear about being killed. Here was someone who had so fully accepted the temporary nature of life that even the threat of immediate death held no power over him. Slowly, the general returned his sword to its sheath. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the temple, leaving the master to continue his gardening in peace. The village remained untouched by the war, not because of any military strategy or negotiated protection, but because of one man's total fearlessness. As the Buddha taught, all made things are temporary. Strive on with hard work. Here we discover the deep power that emerges when we fully accept this basic truth, rather than spending our lives trying to escape it. Why does complete acceptance of death create such presence and authority? Zen Buddhism reveals that most of our fear comes not from outside threats, but from our desperate holding to what is inherently temporary. When that holding dissolves, the threats themselves lose their power to disturb our inner peace. The general's power came from others' fear of death and loss. But someone who has fully accepted the temporary nature of life cannot be threatened with what he has already willingly released. The master's fearlessness wasn't acting or indifference. It was the natural result of understanding change so completely that even his own death held no terror. Think about your own relationship with threats and bullying in daily life. How much of your fear comes from attachment to maintaining your current circumstances, keeping your reputation, or protecting your physical comfort? The master's response suggests that true safety comes not from being untouchable, but from having nothing that can be taken away. This doesn't mean being passive or welcoming harm. The master wasn't seeking death or encouraging violence. Rather, his complete acceptance of death's certainty freed him from the paralyzing fear that controls most people when facing genuine danger. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." The master's single response contained more power than any threat, because it came from a place of total acceptance, rather than resistance or fear. Tonight, as you consider the various pressures and threats you face, can you remember the master's deep response to the general sword? Can you find the space where acceptance of change creates not giving up, but a kind of solid presence that cannot be scared? Buddha's wisdom reminds us the whole secret of life is to have no fear. True freedom comes not from avoiding danger, but from understanding so completely that we cannot ultimately be harmed, that outside threats become powerless to disturb our essential peace. Now let us explore a story about the strange nature of spiritual seeing and the limits of idea understanding. This is the teaching of 3 strikes and deeper vision. In the mountain monastery where the 6th patriarch Huineng taught, students came from across China to study with the master, whose realization was said to beat all others of his time. Among these seekers was a smart young monk named Shenhui, known for his sharp mind and probing questions. Unlike many students who approached the patriarch with humble requests for basic instruction, Shenhui often challenged the master with fancy philosophical questions. One afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through the monastery windows and the air carried the peaceful sounds of monks going about their daily practice, Shenhui found the 6th patriarch sitting quietly in the main hall. The master's posture was perfectly still, his breathing soft and natural, his face calm yet alert, the picture of meditation in action. Seeing a chance to test his understanding against the master's realization, Shenhui approached with a question that had been forming in his mind during his own meditation practice. The nature of seeing during spiritual practice had become a source of great curiosity and confusion for him. "Hi, Master," Shenhui said, bowing respectfully, but speaking with the confidence of someone who believed his question particularly smart. "When you sit in meditation, do you see or not?" To Shenhui, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable question into the mechanics of enlightened awareness. Did awakened consciousness involve special kinds of seeing? Did meditation reveal magical visions or higher perceptions unavailable to ordinary minds? Or did true realization transcend seeing altogether, existing in some pure state beyond sensory experience? What he received in response was completely unexpected. Without warning, the 6th patriarch picked up his wooden teaching stick and struck Shenhui 3 times in fast succession. Not gently, but with enough force that the blows stung sharply and left the young monk both physically uncomfortable and mentally confused. "When I hit you," the patriarch asked, with the same calm tone one might use to discuss the weather, "does it hurt or not?" Shenhui rubbed his smarting shoulders, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. The question seemed simple enough, yet something about the context made him suspect that a straightforward answer might be inadequate. The physical feeling was undeniable, yet the spiritual meanings felt complex. "It both does and does not hurt," he replied carefully, feeling that the master was pointing towards some puzzle beyond ordinary logic. "I both see and do not see," the 6th patriarch responded, his words carrying the weight of direct experience rather than philosophical guessing. But Shen Hui's mind wasn't satisfied with puzzle. He needed to understand the mechanics to categorize and explain this teaching in terms his thinking mind could grasp. How can you both see and not see? He pressed, genuine confusion evident in his voice. That seems opposite. Either you see during meditation or you don't. How can both be true at the same time? The patriarch's response came with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping students move beyond the limits of thinking in opposites. What I see, he explained with gentle clarity, are the waverings and wanderings of my own mind. What I do not see is the right and wrong and good and bad of other people. This is my seeing and not seeing. With these words, the entire teaching became clear. The master wasn't speaking about magical visions or high states, but about the basic shift in seeing that accompanies genuine spiritual maturity. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us, the mind is everything, what you think you become. This teaching relates deeply to the patriarch's lesson about the nature of awakened seeing. Why do we become confused when spiritual teachings go beyond ordinary logic? Zen Buddhism explains that our thinking mind operates through opposite categories: seeing or not seeing, pain or no pain, right or wrong. But enlightened awareness doesn't eliminate these experiences. It changes our relationship to them. The deeper teaching here shows us what real spiritual seeing actually involves. The patriarch sees his own mental processes clearly, the rising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and reactions. This isn't a magical power, but the natural result of sustained mindfulness practice. He observes the waverings and wanderings of consciousness without being lost in them. At the same time, he doesn't see in the judgmental sense, putting categories of right and wrong, good and bad onto others' behavior. This non-seeing isn't ignorance, but wisdom, recognizing that such judgments often say more about the watcher than the watched. Look deeply at your own patterns of seeing. How much of what you think you see in others actually reflects your own mental pictures? When someone bothers you, are you seeing their actual behavior clearly, or are you seeing your own triggers and reactions? When someone impresses you, are you recognizing their genuine qualities, or are you seeing your own desires for approval or achievement? This ancient wisdom lights up the difference between reactive seeing and clear seeing. Reactive seeing involves our past training, our emotional needs, our judgmental habits. Clear seeing involves awareness that recognizes its own processes while remaining open to what's actually present. Zen Master Dogen taught to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. This teaching points to the same insight the patriarch offered. True seeing involves turning attention toward our own mental processes, rather than focusing on outside judgments and evaluations. The 3 strikes Shen Hui received weren't punishment, but skillful teaching. Physical pain that both does and does not hurt points toward the mystery of conscious experience itself. Pain arises in awareness, is felt fully, yet doesn't define or limit the awareness that experiences it. Similarly, thoughts and emotions arise in consciousness without staining its essential clarity. Think about how this teaching might transform your daily experience. Instead of constantly evaluating others' behavior, finding fault, making comparisons, making opinions, what if you turned that same attention toward observing your own mental reactions? What patterns would you discover in the wanderings and waverings of your own mind? This doesn't mean we become passive or lose our capacity for judgment. Rather, we develop the ability to respond from clarity rather than reactivity. When we see our own judgmental habits clearly, we naturally become less caught in them. When we observe our mental pictures, we're less likely to mistake them for real reality. In Zen practice, we grow what's called mirror mind, awareness that reflects whatever arises without being stained or changed by it. This mirror sees everything clearly while maintaining its essential emptiness and openness. Tonight, As you notice your mind sorting and judging the experiences of your day, can you remember the patriarch's teaching? Can you turn your attention toward the seer rather than constantly evaluating what is seen? Can you discover the freedom that comes from seeing your own mental processes without being enslaved by them? Buddha spoke of this when he said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." By learning to see our own mental patterns with compassion rather than judgment, we develop the clarity to see others with equal kindness and understanding. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about happiness and the nature of wanting. This is the stonecutter's journey. High in the mountain villages, there lived a simple stonecutter who had discovered the secret of happiness without knowing it. Each dawn, he would climb winding paths to the quarries, his tools balanced across his shoulders. As he worked among the stones, he would sing old mountain songs that echoed across the valleys. Though he was poor by society's measures, living in a modest hut with few things, the stonecutter wanted nothing more than what he had. His simple life felt complete. The rhythm of his work, the beauty of the mountains, the satisfaction of honest labor. His heart held not a care in the world. One day he was called to work on the big mansion of a wealthy nobleman. As he approached the estate, his eyes widened at the beauty before him. Marble columns reached toward the sky. Gardens spread in perfect order. For the first time in his life, the stonecutter felt the sharp pang of desire pierce his happiness. "If only I were rich," he sighed, "then I would not have to earn my living in sweat and toil as I do now." To his amazement, a voice whispered from the stones, "Your wish has been granted. From now on, anything you desire will be given to you." He returned home that evening to find his humble hut replaced by a mansion as big as the nobleman's. Overwhelmed with joy, he abandoned his tools and began enjoying the rich life of the wealthy. But one hot afternoon, looking from his fancy window, he saw the king's royal parade passing by. The monarch sat in cool shade, surrounded by noble men and servants, appearing calm and powerful above the common heat. "How I wish I were a king myself," he thought, and immediately found himself lying in silk cushions within the royal carriage. But the carriage proved warmer than expected. Even through thick walls, the sun's heat pierced relentlessly. "I wish I were the sun," he declared, and found himself sending waves of light and heat across the universe. As the sun, he felt magnificent and all-powerful until thick storm clouds gathered, completely blocking his rays. "I wish to be a cloud." And so he became a huge storm cloud, glorying in his power to block the sun. But as he transformed into falling rain, he met a huge rock that blocked his path completely, a mere rock more powerful than I. "I want to be a rock." Suddenly he stood tall upon the mountainside, feeling he had achieved true permanence. But soon he heard chipping sounds at his base. Looking down, he saw a tiny human figure cutting chunks of stone away, a weak creature, more powerful than me. "I want to be a man again." And so he found himself once more a stone cutter, climbing familiar mountain paths. But now something had changed. As he shaped stones and felt mountain breezes, his heart swelled with deep happiness. His song returned richer than before, because he had learned to be happy with exactly who he was. The Buddha once said, "Health is the greatest gift, happiness, the greatest wealth." This ancient wisdom lights up the endless cycle of wanting that keeps us from recognizing the richness already present in our lives. Why do we chase after different conditions? Always believing happiness lies in the next change. Each desire fulfilled only reveals the next desire, creating an endless cycle of dissatisfaction. The stonecutter's journey reveals the uselessness of seeking happiness through outside circumstances. Think about your own versions of this cycle. "I'll be happy when I get moved up only to discover new stresses. I'll be happy with more money only to find greater wealth brings new worries." Each achievement reveals the next mountain to climb. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi said, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This puzzle points to the heart of happiness, the ability to fully accept what is while still engaging wholeheartedly with life's natural changes. The stonecutter's final change wasn't into something greater, but into appreciation for what he had always been. His work remained the same, but his relationship to life was completely changed. Happiness isn't found in having different experiences, but in bringing different awareness to whatever experiences arise. Tonight, as you notice the mind's habitual reaching toward what's not here, can you experiment with the stonecutter's final wisdom? Can you find the song that emerges when you stop trying to be anything other than what you are? As the Buddha taught, happiness is natural wealth, luxury is fake poverty. The greatest change available isn't becoming something different, but recognizing the built-in completeness of what we already are. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about the difference between fighting and flowing. This is the teaching of the old man and the waterfall. In a mountain village where a fast river carved its way through ancient rocks, an old Taoist sage often walked along the water's edge, watching the dance between the flowing current and the solid stones that tried to redirect its path. The villagers knew him as a gentle, thoughtful man who seemed to understand something deep about the natural world that others missed. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered and rain began to fall, the river swelled with unusual force. The current grew violent and unpredictable, rushing toward a high waterfall that dropped into a rocky canyon below. Most people avoided the area during such conditions, knowing that anyone who fell into the rapids would face almost certain death against the jagged rocks at the bottom of the falls. The old man, however, had been caught by the sudden storm while walking along his usual path. As he tried to make his way back to safety, the muddy bank gave way beneath his feet. Before he could catch himself, he tumbled into the raging water and was immediately swept away by the powerful current. Villagers who saw his fall cried out in horror. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching as the old man was carried toward the waterfall by waters too violent and fast for any rescue attempt. They could only watch in sadness as he disappeared over the edge, plunging into the churning chaos below. Everyone assumed the worst. No one could survive such a fall, especially not an elderly man with limited strength. The villagers prepared themselves to search for his body downstream, once the waters calmed enough to make such a search possible. But to their amazement, as they hurried toward the base of the waterfall, they saw the old man coming out from the water far below, completely unharmed. He walked calmly to the shore, water streaming from his clothes, and sat down to rest as peacefully as if he had simply taken a refreshing swim on a pleasant day. The villagers rushed to him, unable to believe what they had seen. "How is this possible?" they asked in wonder. "How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks so dangerous. By all reason, you should have been killed." The old man smiled at their concern and amazement. He wrung water from his sleeves and considered their question carefully before answering. "I survived," he said simply, "because I adjusted myself to the water, not the water to me. When I felt myself falling, I did not fight against the current or try to force it to change direction. Without thinking, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. When the water wanted to go down, I went down. When it swirled, I swirled with it. Plunging into the whirlpool, I came out with the whirlpool. I became like the water itself. And this is how I survived." The villagers listened in silence, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more than a lucky accident. They had seen a demonstration of a deep principle that the old man had spent years learning from his careful watching of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to change. Being is always becoming. Here we discover the wisdom of working with life's currents rather than exhausting ourselves in useless resistance to forces beyond our control. Why do we instinctively fight against difficult circumstances when flow and adjustment might serve us better? Zen Buddhism reveals that our ego mind believes it can control outside conditions through force of will. But this approach often creates more suffering than the original difficulty. The old man's survival wasn't mere luck. It was the result of understanding something essential about the nature of life itself. When we align ourselves with the natural flow of events, rather than demanding that life conform to our preferences, we often discover resources and possibilities that resistance makes invisible. Think about your own relationship with challenging circumstances. How much energy do you spend fighting against situations you cannot change? The old man's teaching suggests a different approach, not passive giving in, but conscious adjustment that maintains our essential nature while flowing with changing conditions. This doesn't mean accepting harmful situations or abandoning our values. The old man didn't give up his desire to survive. He simply changed his strategy for survival. Instead of fighting the water's power, he used it. Instead of resisting its direction, he moved with it while maintaining his awareness and intention. In relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we often face similar choices. We can exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes, control other people's behavior, or make outside circumstances conform to our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with what is actually present, finding creative ways to achieve our deeper purposes through adjustment rather than force. Zen master taught, water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away rock which cannot yield and is destroyed. The old man embodied this teaching, showing that seeming weakness can be a source of huge strength when applied with wisdom. The Buddha said, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. This principle extends beyond hatred to all forms of resistance. Problems are rarely solved by fighting against them directly, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the underlying forces involved. Look deeply at a current source of stress or conflict in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction, rather than learning to swim with it? What would it mean to adjust yourself to the situation while maintaining your essential values and intentions? Tonight, as you meet the inevitable currents of daily life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you remember the old man's wisdom? Can you find ways to maintain your center while flowing with forces you cannot change? Discovering that sometimes the most direct path to your goals is the one that appears to go around obstacles rather than through them. Buddha's wisdom reminds us in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with life's currents is ultimately about letting go of our need to control everything while maintaining our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. Like water, we can be both powerful and yielding, both persistent and adaptive, both strong and gentle. As our shared journey comes to a gentle conclusion, simply notice the quality of this present moment. Feel the quiet that remains when the stories have ended. A stillness that was not created, but simply revealed. The deep calm you can touch right now is not a treasure you have found, but the very foundation of your own being, patiently waiting beneath the shifting sands of thought. The Buddha taught, even as a solid rock is unshaken by the wind, so are the wise unshaken by praise or blame. This is the quiet truth that has echoed through each of the deep Buddhist stories we've shared to find peace tonight. The winds of life, our worries, our plans, the endless commentary of the mind are constant. The stories were not about stopping this wind, but about discovering the solid rock of awareness within. Each one was a lesson in finding that internal anchor, that deep-seated stability that is unmoved by the passing weather of our experience. Even now, if the mind offers another thought, you don't have to be carried away by it. The wisdom grown here is the understanding that you are not the wind, you are the rock. This recognition is now a more familiar space for you, a quiet refuge you can return to again and again. As you settle deeper into stillness, allow yourself to feel this solid quality. Sense the groundedness in your body and the space that surrounds your thoughts. This is the essence of true rest. Not striving for a state, but resting in the state that is already here. In the silence that follows my voice, simply be with the feeling of this solid center, observing the gentle rhythm of your breath as it flows on its own. These teachings are a timeless reminder of the strength that lies in non-reaction. They point to a freedom that is always available when we stop letting the outside world dictate our inner peace. As you drift from this quiet space into the rest of your night and onward into your day, may you carry this sense of unshakable calm with you. Let it be the silent ground that supports you steady and true through all of life's moments. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Sleep well